Good morning. I'm very excited to be here. I'm excited to see faces. I'm excited to hang out with you guys today. I'm excited to figure out how to work this fancy clicker. Let me make sure I took my phone out of my pocket. That's just so that I can keep time. Because if not, I would spend the whole day with you. This is a fancy clicker. Okay, so I did spend 10 years working with Bennett Napier at the National Association of Dental Laboratories and the National Board for Certification. And then I went from there to the Pankey Institute as their CEO, and I spent 8 years there. It was really no secret that I'd spent 10 years advocating on behalf of dental laboratory technicians and the important place that you play in dentistry. And I didn't feel like I could make a big change, so I went to talk to doctors. I was like, I will switch sides and try to do the education side and try to show doctors that you can be a good doctor all day, but you will never be great at what you do if you don't partner with a good laboratory and get a good technician. So I now work at this organization, Beyond Coaching. I launched it 2 years ago, and my purpose was to help organizations and executives to avoid the things that get their businesses in trouble. So I am a success coach. I do some consulting for nonprofits. I work with dentists. And I find that to be a lot of fun. And how many of you were here in October? Everybody? Good, good. Well, welcome back. It's good to see you again. So when I was here in October, I was originally scheduled for March and had this whole great, cheerleading program about this was going to be the best year ever. And so when I was rescheduled for October, the lazy part of me said, I'm just going to do that same presentation, but 2020 was not the best year ever. So I rewrote that presentation. So here's our goals for today. We're going to take a look at the past 12 months. I've got some statistical stuff. It's not that fun, but it's good for those of you who you have an analytic mind, and I'll show you the most up-to-date information about how the past 12 months has affected your clients, what it's looking like on a national scale for dentists. Then we're going to talk about a little bit about the history. I wanted to take a look back to see how we got to where we are today in terms of our history, and then we're going to talk about mindset and about how you can set yourself up for success. So before I start with that, I'm going to say that I've been in dentistry for, actually this month is 20 years, which is kind of amazing. I tell people that once you start working in dentistry, it never lets you go. I don't care if you're a sales rep or you're a nonprofit exec. If you take a job in dentistry, it sucks you in and you never get to get out, right? How many of you wish that you had had that disclaimer when you took your first job in dentistry? So one of the things I really like to do is I like to spend some time in gratitude. And this isn't like the hippie gratitude, although I would love meditation, but I fall asleep or I get fidgety. This is really about me looking at what the gifts I've had in life. I've been super fortunate in my trajectory in dentistry, and I always want to be able to thank people as it can, that I can recognize. And so I have this unique opportunity because my entire career in dentistry is owed to one person. So I don't know if you can look back and think when there was a pivotal spot in your life, but my entire career in dentistry is one person, and it's Bennett. I worked for a nonprofit. We lived in the same town. His wife and I, we took a program together, but he called me out of the blue one day and said, would you like to have dinner? I'd like to talk to you about something. And when he offered me the job to work with him at NADL and NBC, it changed the trajectory of my career. So I want to thank you in front of everybody for believing me. I was a pain in the rump to work with. I am not the easiest person to work with because I have very strong ideas, and I like my ideas to come to fruition. And so we had a work marriage for 10 years, but he gave me lots of space, and you trusted me, and I really appreciate that. So thank you very much for that opportunity. Okay, so we're going to look at a 12-month look at dental practices. So I don't know how many of you know that the American Dental Association has something called the Health Policy Institute. The Health Policy Institute, when COVID hit, when the ADA and all of the wisdom said shut down dental practices, the Health Policy Institute started surveying the ADA members. They did a survey every single week in the last 12 months. And every week they asked some questions that were static, and then they asked some new questions. And they would have like a question of the week kind of thing. So this, because we are where we are now, we're 12 months later, we actually can see a bit of a curve of what's happening with those practices. So this information it's from last week. This information's from last week. So they do it every single week. I'm not going to say I look at it every week, but when I'm going to do a presentation, I do look at the averages. This is what it looked like the week of March 23rd, 2020. So just to give you a little breakdown, nobody was open. 0% of dental practices were open for business as usual. 19% said they're completely closed. There were some dental practices that were closed but seeing emergency patients. That depended on the state. Some of the states allowed that. ADA wasn't super sure about that. And then the open but lower patient volume, those were mostly like oral surgeons and people who had surgery privileges. But it's kind of dismal, right? Everything was closed a year ago. So this is the trend from March 23rd of last year, when everybody was closed, to now, to March 15th. So basically, just to kind of give you a caption of it, that little area over there that closed and not seeing any patients, that's less than 1%. It's 0.7% of the practices are closed, and they either are closed indefinitely or I think they retired. I don't know that they're going to open back up. But the things that are important for you guys are 58% are saying we're open and we have business as usual. And business as usual is interesting. We're going to dig into that a little bit because I was curious about that. Open and business as usual, open with lower patient volume. So almost a 50-50 split like that. So this is what it looks like in Texas, nationally. 99% of all of the practices said that they're open. But all of the ones that say business as usual, they're only at 80% of either their collections or their patient volume. So that means that there was still a 20% decline in their business as of right now. So who's shocked by that? Is anybody feeling that in their own lab? So in your state, 55%, I broke out Texas. By the way, I forgot, I should have put it up on the slides, but I can give you the website address for the Health Policy Institute. It does break it down, a lot of this information by state. So Texas, 55% reported open and business as usual, 44% reported lower patient volume, and you're a little bit higher on the totally closed. Not much, but a little bit higher on the totally closed. So to give you an idea about the validity of this information, the first week that the ADA did this survey, which was March 23rd, the week of March 23rd of last year, over 19,000 practices answered the survey. They didn't have anything else to do, but they answered the survey. So now they average about 3,000 practices a week answer this survey. I think there were 211 practices as of last week in Texas that responded to this. So you can decide how much you think that that's valid or not. So patient volume, obviously when you look, the purple up there is less than 5%. So the first month of COVID, we showed extreme practices that showed less than 5% of their patient volume. Now we don't have anybody who's saying that they're less than 5%, but we do still have practices that are less than 25%, and not very many of them are more than 95%. I'm sorry, I should go back to this. The question was, how does this week compare to your typical practice in terms of patient volume? So that's the static question that they've been asking since March 23rd of last year. And then that's the trend for it. So the good news is that the trend is going in the direction that you want to see. It's improving. and their patient volume is going up. This is the same thing but collections, and it was the same kind of question. How does this week compare to your typical practice week in terms of collections? So they're still down on collections. The good thing is again, no more purple, less than 5%, so that's good. And we saw that, it's interesting, we saw that really starting to happen the 1st of June. So the 1st of June, the trend started to change. And I think most of you know that after this presentation, we take a break, and then Bennett's going to present on the state of industry from the laboratory side. So I'm really curious to see how these numbers translate to what's happening on the laboratory side. But I thought it would be good for you this morning just to kind of see what your dental clients are going through. And then this was paying staff. So the static question they said is your practice paying staff this week? So they've been asking that question since March 23rd of last year. And it's interesting because fortunately, there was never, I think it's interesting, the first week that it happened, there were fewer practices. A lot of practices kept paying their staff. Then when we got into mid-April, practices were like, whoa, I think this might last longer than we think. And they either laid off their staff, stopped paying their staff. What is interesting about this question is in the middle of the survey responses, ADA switched it around a little bit and started asking more questions about if the owner was taking pay. So they were asking about their staff and this, but there is a difference between the owner and the staff. So looks like most practices, 96%, are paying their staff completely. You have about 3% that are paying their staff partially, likely due to a lower patient volume. You would think that their hourly team members are probably taking less hours, and then the few that are not paying at all. So this is the same thing with your state. Texas reported 98.2% said that they are fully paying. 1.8% said partially. You had 0% that said that they were not paying their staff at all. That's kind of good for you, because if they can't pay their staff, I don't think they're going to pay their lab bill. That's maybe conjecture, but that's what it feels like. So here's the public, and here's what practice owners said. So in January, the Health Policy Institute had gone in and done some survey stuff to see, in general, what's the public doing. And they found that when they compared January of 2020 to October of 2020, spending on dental services was down 16%. So the bigger thing was utilization of dental services was down 20%. So people, i.e. people are not going to the dentist. And actually, I find this really interesting because we were just talking about this before, because dental practices have so much more protections in place and have for decades than your average doctor's office, right? If you go get a regular WellCare checkup, does your doctor glove up before COVID? Does your doctor wear a mask? But when you go for WellCare, if you go to your dentist wears gloves, the team wears masks. So I thought this was kind of interesting to me that this had such a huge impact on the one part of healthcare that has sanitized rooms, wiped down lamps, all of these things for decades. I think the rest of the world forgot that, and I don't think the ADA put themselves forward to say, we've been doing this for decades. So the question here was, in the last month, have you taken, and this is as of March 15th, in the last month, have you taken any of the following measures to maintain financial sustainability of your practice? So these were really interesting to me. This is nationally, but change their material supplier. You guys are super excited about that, huh? Or their lab to save money. I mean, 15%. I don't know, I was a little bit surprised about that. What I wish the ADA had asked them is to break that out, right? I want to know the differences. Were they searching for cheaper materials, or were they searching for a cheaper lab, or both? I wish I knew what portion of that was allocated to each rather than sort of lumping that together. because I think for both from the laboratory standpoint and from the materials manufacturers and suppliers standpoint, that's a little bit of a frustrating statistic. What's interesting is, look at the bottom one: sold my practice, joined a DSO or a large group practice, and retired. It's not statistically an enormous amount, 3%, but still. Has anybody seen like one of their clients go into retirement? And by the way, I will be happy to email you these things, so you don't have to write down all this crazy crap. Has anybody seen, like, does anybody lost a client to retirement? Yeah? To it? Yeah, okay. So that's what I saw that I was working with doctors that were like, maybe had a 3-year plan, and actually during COVID brought in associates and went ahead and did the exit plan quicker than they had originally thought that they would. Anybody see any of their clients sell to a DSO or any kind of, yeah. So here's the answer to the other. And I thought this was interesting too. These people said other, and this is what they said about it. Dentists reduced their own salary. I thought the added staff and increased volume of work, I was like, that's pretty interesting. 8% was there. Working longer hours, a PPE surcharge, a variety of things that they've done to try to maintain their sustainability. And I presented for NADL University in September, and one of the questions of the week at that time was about the emotional impact that it was having, that COVID was having on the practice or on the dental practice owner. And like at the time, it was 38% of the dental practice owners were saying that they felt a high level of anxiety or depression. I would love to know if we surveyed lab owners what that answer would be. I kind of think you guys are made of some gritty stuff, but 38%. So basically, a large portion of dental practice owners were saying they were having a really tough time dealing with the emotional standpoint of what was happening during COVID. So how does this affect you? Bennett's going to answer some of those things. And hopefully shed a little bit more light on what these numbers mean to your numbers. So I want to go into a history lesson, and just forgive me for the rabbit hole, I can't help myself. I was doing research for this, and I started thinking about mindset and about how we are where we are now, and what the difference between somebody who's really successful in their business and somebody who's struggled in their business. And I'm curious, like, does anybody have like their recipe for what has made you successful? No? Just dumb luck. So I don't believe in luck. I'm not Irish. I don't believe in it. I believe that it's hard work. For me, it's been tenacity. It's just, I don't give up very easily, so I just stay focused and I'm very tenacious. But the reason I started thinking about this is a whole bunch of changes. Last year was a big change for the world, but a whole bunch of changes have happened in decades over dentistry. And the one thing I think is kind of interesting, both for clinical practices as well as for laboratories, is you don't have to change. Like, you don't have to. How many people know there's still like very small mom and pop labs that haven't gotten into digital technology? There's absolutely that on the clinical side. There are absolutely doctors who still do everything in paper charts, and that's what they're comfortable with. So you don't have to change, right? But then last year something happened, and how many people has anybody changed their systems or anything based on what happened last year? Nothing? Same billing, same systems, same everything? Okay. And that's kind of my point. So, like, for me, I changed my business last year because what I was doing, which was providing value, which was working with practices and nonprofits on their teams, what happens when your team isn't coming in the office anymore? Was the team the biggest concern of my clients last year? It was right up until March 15th when I was on site with onboarding a new client. And March 23rd, they didn't give a crap. After they were like, hey, so I had to change my business model. What was important to them? One was some crisis management, so some leadership and crisis management. The other was like, how do we talk to our teams? But the bigger thing was, how do we make sure that everyone knows that our business is still out there and available when we don't look, when we're not in our physical location? How do we make sure we do that? So I had to shift pretty considerably. I also had to tell my clients, my dental clients, that they didn't have to pay me because they didn't have any patients. So I had a 2 a.m. conversation with myself about that. It worked out, but I did have a 2 a.m. conversation with myself. Does anybody know what this symbol is? Yeah. Yep. Say it loud. Renault. And so what is Renault? It's a French car company. So does anybody know how Renault impacted what you do today in dentistry? I know, I'm so powerful right now because I have all the answers. I just need to let that stir in just a minute because I have a bunch of children that are college age and above, and I'm the dumbest person that they know. Okay, so this is a French car company, and this company changed dentistry. Do you know who this guy is? His name's right on there. So Peter Brazier worked for Renault in the 60s, and he is the inventor of CAD. Do you know that? He invented CAD. So when was, and between 1966 and 1968, he worked at Renault, and he was looking for a better way to help Renault design and manufacture cars. So did the manufacturing come before or after that? Anybody know? Came before. So before there was CAD, there was computer-assisted manufacturing. So the manufacturing was in the form of punch things. So in auto mechanics and in other things, they had the manufacturing part. Think about a piece of sheet metal that they would line up. This will show age. Does anybody remember when you voted by those CHAD things? So that was the original concept around computer-assisted manufacturing. They would create a template, and then they would punch the holes where it needed to go. So they'd run these pieces of sheet metal through, and the holes would punch, and then they would hand them to a person. The person would put them on the car, and that's where they'd put the rivets, right? We've been doing that forever. But in the 50s, they created that as a form of computer-assisted manufacturing. The problem is that it was still largely dependent on people, and it was really hindered because you couldn't design things. It was very hindered on the design. So this genius worked on something, and he found out this simple concept. He said, what was the thing that was holding back computer-assisted design? And it was that the computer only understood lines. And he needed in cars what? Curves. So how did they do cars? Very similar to the way you make teeth, is they created a mold, right? And then they used to press the metal into the mold. So he's like, I want to be able to create that without having to hand do it. So he began line drawings. This was one of his first things that he wanted to see if you could create. First of all, it's beautiful. So he created these line drawings. And from these line drawings, he said, all the computer needs to do is follow the line. So what's a circle? It's a continuous curved line. And that was his aha moment. So that's what he brought to car manufacturing, and that's how he changed the industry. So that piece of wood that's next to him, I'm sorry, these were really fuzzy images, but I couldn't help it. I loved them so much. That was one of the first things that he did in CAD, that he produced from a CAD CAM model. And I thought it was amazing. So I'm going to go back to the year. In the 50s, CAM came out, and then in the 60s, CAD came out. So then what happened? Well, bringing something to market is a lot more difficult than, well, I don't know. I was actually about to poo-poo his whole thing. I think this is pretty genius. But getting it to market. So then what happens with it? So there were some people who, in 1970, I forget the guy's name, he tried to bring it to market, and his business shut down after 2 years. So then IBM kind of gets in the mix, and by the mid-70s, IBM thinks that they have a software product that can merge CAD and CAM together. It's very expensive. It's not for the general market. So where does it go? Does anybody know really who grasped hold of at least the computer-assisted design? Pardon me? No, yes, airplane manufacturing would be a good, no, actually what happened is it went into architecture and engineering. So the draftsmen, people who were draftsmen, did anybody have anybody? I have a family of architects and engineers. So my uncle, this is like the only place I can say this. I can say this in this state and in Georgia. I have an uncle who is now my stepfather. Anyway, if you buy me 2 glasses of wine, I will tell you that story. Then it's like she's lying. She will tell you that story with no wine. No, I'm holding out now. I'm older now. So he is an architect. He designed lots of hotels in downtown Miami and on Brickell and these beautiful high-rise condos. But I remember when his oldest son, went to University of Florida for architecture, and they first teach them drafting. And drafting was a drafting table, and you drew everything out, and they teach them this really interesting font. They all write in the same font, which is kind of cool. I don't know why they have to teach them that, but they do. So that's all of the stuff that they learned. Well, by the time my cousin Bill came out of architectural school and he was working with his dad, they started to bring in not just the software, but you needed to be able to have a computer in your office that could actually help you with that. So they started to bring in computer-assisted design, and it took off in architecture and engineering, because you could put in some set things, parameters. Not surprising to you today, right? Isn't that one of the funniest things, that you understand that there's parameters, but your doctor doesn't always understand that? Like, if you want this much tooth, you have to reduce this much tooth. Because if you don't reduce by 2, but you add 4, what happens? It's like out to here. It's weird. It's weird. It's like second grade math. It's very strange. So it did go into architecture and engineering. And it was in there forever. And yes, it went into airplanes and ships and all kinds of other manufacturing. Just show of hands, how many people had CAD or CAM, because how many people had CAD or CAM in your laboratory in, I'm going to say 1990. Yep. How about 95? 95? How about, so I know when I started with NADL, it was in 2001. And I know in 2000, let me think, probably 2008 or 7, at a Visions meeting, when we were prepping for that meeting, I went to some manufacturers. Some openly said that they had intraoral scanning, and some we knew that they had it, but they weren't talking about who they were acquiring it from, and tried to beg them to do a panel. You remember that, Bennett? I went around and was begging people, said, I don't want you to release any information. I just want you to talk about the general concept of why intraoral scanning, why are you investing in it? How's it going to change dentistry? It was a fairly successful panel, but that was probably mid-2000s. So in 2000, who had CAD or CAM in their lab? Okay. 2005. Yeah. 2010. Who's got it now? So the reason I'm asking this is because you can I mean, dentistry is amazing. This guy created this before I was born. And we can be slow adapters or adopters if we want to be. I still think that's stunningly beautiful that he just drew it. So, does anybody know what happened in this year that also had a massive impact on dentistry today? Pardon me? Desktop computers. That's a super good guess, and probably, maybe. When I was a little girl, my dad was a police chief, and I remember him taking me in when they went, it was probably like in a decade after this, probably in 80 or 81. And I remember my dad taking me into their police department to show me their computer room. So clearly they weren't ready for a computer room because it was a little room with a big computer. It was like this gigantic box, almost like a storage container, and you just had to kind of walk around it. But my dad was so proud of that they were going to computerized dispatch and computerized records, and probably they were at more risk for burning their building down than anything else. So in 1971 was weirdly the year of the fondue pot. But the thing that happened in 1971 that changed dentistry is that FedEx came to be. Does anybody think that FedEx did not change dentistry? What happened? It didn't happen in 1971. But so I'm not gonna make you age yourself, but just raise your hand if you didn't have a dental laboratory until 2010. Anybody who didn't work in the industry before 2010? Anybody who didn't work in the industry before 2000? Before 90? Okay, so from your experience then, for everybody, has anybody seen a shift in your own lab from being local to being regional to being statewide or to being national, right? I know you know that, Paul. We saw that. We especially saw the bigger the laboratory, right? We saw, I don't know when Jim Gladwell went national, but by the time I got in the industry in the early 2000s, he was everywhere. So FedEx changed the way we think about how to get things. It had a huge impact on dentistry. It had a big impact on food too. It changed the way we think about food. It changed what we expect in a restaurant and we expect in a grocery store, because everything was trucked before that. I love this picture. I got it off the internet. But at Pankey, we have two of Dr. Pankey's original dental chairs, and they looked like this, except for in better shape. And that cabinet on the left, we had one of those too. Does anybody know what that is? I really don't. I don't have information here. I'm trying to figure out, was it just like instruments? Is anybody old enough to know anything about that? Yeah, was it just instrument trays? They're so pretty. We have one of those that was his. The same thing but it had like a mirror. It had a thing and then a mirror on top. It's like this beautiful piece of wood tongue and groove. Instrument trays, huh? So there's a big difference between what this practice looks like and what we think of today, right? You wouldn't, if you walked into your dentist today, if you walked into a new dentist today, and you went back to a treatment suite and it looked like this, you're out, right? I'm out. But look at it really. Look at it really. What is the difference? What's the difference? Besides the fact that it looks like janky, what's the difference? Pardon me? No computer. But essentially, so we don't need that. We don't need the big thing with the trays. But other than that, like if we took that out, we still have a chair. We still have that like pretty little spit bowl. We still have, I don't know what that other thing is, but I think it's something to take, it's like something to take, well, no, it's a handpiece. I mean, what is different really? We don't use the what? Use that little silver thing is a little spit pretty bowl. Yeah. But you say you don't use it, but yes, they're in a bazillion dental practices. They're still there. I mean, I agree with you. A lot of people don't, but there are probably in more practices than not. I would venture to guess. Someone gets to tell me I'm wrong. So my point of that is, we made it prettier. We want them to look different. So now I'm going to ask the tough questions. From the 70s, which was when that picture was, to now. Well, actually, I'm going to ask you this. For those of you who have had practices that are old, or labs that are older, how do you set your fees? And I don't mean to tell me, like, what are the components of setting your fees? Cost plus. Hey, Gary, good to see you. Cost plus. Yeah.
So, a lot of, where did you want to establish your fee? Probably didn't have a whole lot to do with a business concept of what does it cost me to make a crown and deliver it and put some money in my pocket.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to turn this over to him. But that's exactly right. I mean, we and dentists are the same way, but we are sort of in the profession where we set our fee largely based on what our competitor sets their fee at. And I know when I switched to Pankey, and we do tons of education on this, that was a passionate area for me, for dentists, is not to guess your fee and set your fee based on what the guy down the street is doing. First of all, the guy down the street may be dumber than you are, and maybe losing money hand over fist. There's a lot of variables in there. But I would venture to say that most people in this industry set their fees, let's pretend like you don't set your fee off of your competitor, but set your fees on a pretty simple thing where you use time and materials and your fixed overhead. Because that's how we did unit pricing, right? And it probably could change, but time, materials, fixed overhead. Fixed overhead, to Gary's point, is your rent, your team members that you have to pay because you don't pay them hourly, insurance, whatever else. So is that fairly accurate? Anybody doing it a totally different way? Anybody really look at the formula? It's okay, you get to say no. Because I will tell you, when I worked with dentists, I was surprised. I was like, how do you decide what a crown fee is? Like, how do you decide how much you charge? And they were like, oh, well, ADA says the national average is. I was like, well, I for sure want to be an average. They don't know. They don't know. So is Miami, Florida fee, and we all see this, right? So is the fee in Miami, Florida, why do we think that it's okay in Miami to charge more than we charge, let's say, in Polk County, Florida, middle of the state? I would use an analogy here, but I don't know Texas as well. So we say things like demographics and market. We say that. I think, honestly, it has to do with overhead. Is my rent, if I had a lab in Miami, and the cost of living in Miami is higher, so my fixed overhead is higher. Because my materials aren't higher. They shouldn't be. My time isn't more, but we think it's because it's what the market will bear. I think it's because of fixed overhead. So first of all, this picture makes me crazy because the stupid teeth are upside down. But I tried to turn it and make it right side up, and it just looked weird. So I'm going to go back to this concept, and when I worked with Bennett, we talked about this a lot. Like, is a crown a crown a crown a crown? This little chattering teeth over here is what the public thinks teeth are supposed to look like. Anybody see the posterior teeth? Those are awesome. I dare you to make some of those. But that's what people think, like that's what the public thinks teeth are like. So is there any difference in how you would charge for this? I mean, if this is what people think that they are. So this whole long thing is to say that dentistry's changed tremendously, but I bet that most of us have not changed our mindset about how we charge or the services that we deliver. So if FedEx and CAD/CAM significantly changed the way dentistry is, certainly FedEx maybe brought some challenges, right? You used to just have to compete with the guy down the street, right? You had to be 1% more predictable than the lab down the street. 1% more timely than the lab down the street. $5 cheaper than the lab down the street. Listen, if a doctor will leave you because for like the $5 thing, and I've heard that before, or whatever it is, I mean, you don't have to be a woman to understand. Let him go. So the reason that this changed so significantly is that it broadened people's access. It broadened dentistry. We just didn't broaden our thoughts to it. So how many of you have a local, or you're completely local within driving distance of your lab? Most of you? Your lab service area is completely local. It's within driving distance. Most of you? How many of you feel like your doctor uses a lab that is regional or national in addition to your lab? Yeah. And I'm just curious, like, why do you think that is? First of all, I wish the ADA would stop telling them that the average dentist uses 3 labs. Like, I cannot imagine that that's easier to do. I just can't imagine. Other than like maybe having to, like if you don't do ortho or you don't do removables and they have to use somebody specific for that, I really do not understand that. To me, this feels like, why would you want 3 husbands? Like, it just seems like such a big thing to juggle. I don't understand.
He just got it. It spreads your lab bill out 3 ways.
I don't think that and I love dentists. I work with dentists all the time. I don't think it's that conniving. So when I worked for NADL, I used to think that there was like, I confused like ignorance with malice. And I used to think like that doctors didn't care. I was like, they don't care about quality. 10 years on the lab side, that's all I ever thought. I was like, okay, they don't care. Then I got to Pankey and I realized it's not that they don't care, they don't know. There is way more ignorance than there is malice. They just didn't know. And especially when I started working with younger doctors, I realized they don't even know what to look for. The number one question that I got when I worked there was, how do I find a good lab? My question back was, how do you know you're a good dentist? And they would say, well, I'm here. And I would say, great. How do you know you don't already work with a good lab? Well, I said, if you had to give your lab a grade, oh, you're going to really hate me for this. It's not super great. Good thing is I have my mask I can wipe it up with. Okay, well, we have no AV people, so that's okay too. I'm just going to say, I think I saved that. Thank you, appreciate that. So, I'm not really worried about that anymore. So doctors don't know, and I know you guys know this. I know you do, because those of you who have brought your doctors up from one grade level to another, you know that some people don't care, but some people really do. So if I asked a doctor, what grade would you give your laboratory? And a lot of times they'd come back and say, well, I like my lab, they're nice, but they're like maybe at a B. I want to work with I said, well, what do you want? I want to work with an A. Great. are you giving your lab A stuff to work with? And they don't know. They really don't. So I think they've been told or taught that that they're supposed to work with more than one lab. I think it's like a cultural thing, and they think that because everybody does it. So, because I also know that when I've talked to doctors and I ask them what lab I used to tell them all the time, I'm like, please don't tell me, because I have bias. So, but when I ask them, what lab are you working with? And then they tell me, and I'm like, you're working with a really good, high-end, full-service lab. I think it might be you. You should call your lab owner, and you should say, can I meet with you and the technician that mostly does our work? And can you tell me how I can be a better doctor? I mean, again, people don't spend that kind of money and go to Panky without being open to that kind of stuff and receptive to it. But I think they don't really realize. And I would have people tell me, I don't think our lab does that. I'm like, I actually know your lab owner. I know for a fact they do that. They would, when they were starting to get into digital, like when we did a high-end aesthetics course and we showed them how they could print temporaries. Here you can print provisionals. And it's a good, nice smile try and blah, blah, blah. And they'd say, oh, can you recommend a lab for that? Well, what lab do you use? I use ABC Lab. I'm like, they do that. Do you? I don't think so. Yeah, they do. I know they do. Why? Because I follow them on Facebook. You should too. So I don't know that it's I would agree that there probably are some people who like the idea of breaking their lab bill out 3 ways. My objective is that you be able to be so successful you don't have to work with those people. I think it's that they don't know. So, is the cost for both of these restorations the same? I don't have the answer. I'm asking you. No. Why? What's more expensive? The one on the left or the one on the right? The one on the left. Okay? Why? Let me say this. Is it more expensive? Is the charge higher or is the expense to you higher? You can say it. There's no wrong answers. I don't know the answer. The charge to both is higher. Okay. So talk to me about that. The one on the left is more expensive to create and you charge more for it, right? Why?
10 of those, and time makes you make one of those.
Okay. So primarily time? Primarily time? So make 10 of the right for one on the left, right? Okay. Anything else? Are the materials the same? Are the materials higher?
Cost of the equipment to make one on the right is more.
Cost of the equipment on the one on the right is more. Is the materials for the one on the left higher or are they about the same? About the same? Depends on the thing. Depends on the metal, the alloy, sure. So how much different, percentage-wise, how much different in price you charging to your client, well, let's start with you, with your own costs, are they? Percentage-wise, is it 50% more expensive to make the one on the left? 40% more expensive? I mean, you don't have to be right or wrong. You can just I'm just curious. Thank you.
Well, we don't know what we're starting with. You can't answer that question.
So what do you need to know?
Well, number one, you have some fixed costs. The porcelain itself is certainly one thing, but you start with the most expensive thing is process or the metal. Is it a precious metal or is it a non-precious metal?
So let's say it's a precious metal.
Easier if you say it's a non-precious metal.
Let's say it's a non-precious metal. I'm super comfortable being ignorant at the front of the room. I'm about to buy a computer. So non-precious metal. What's the percentage difference in your cost between the one on the left and the one on the right? And I'm not saying like the national average, just in yours, like at 30%, 20%, 40%.
Material cost is probably negligible. It's the labor. The labor cost for the one on the left is significantly higher.
Okay.
So we sell the one on the left
Okay. Okay, so they sell the one on the left, the PFM, for twice as much as the one on the right.
I want to throw a big wrench in this thing. So
Do it! I love that.
Most of these people know how to do the one on the left beautiful. Okay? They all grew up with it. If you put the one on the right, I got to hire this guy to learn how to work that computer.
Okay.
All right? Then I've got a pile of zirconia like this to be able to get it look like that.
Okay.
The remake factor was very high before I got that thing under control. Plus the ovens you're working with, plus all the equipment you're working with. And I know there's guys in here that can make that stuff look beautiful real quick.
So you think you threw a wrench in it, but I absolutely love, what's your name?
Alan,
Alan, you're my favorite person right this second.
I won't be in a minute.
Don't test me, Alan. I raise children. So here's the thing that was my point, which is exactly what Alan said. We said the one on the left is more expensive, primarily because you have so much labor time in it, right? And the one on the right was cheaper, primarily because, and I'm going to agree with you, but primarily because there was less labor and you could make 6 of those compared to one of the other. What is the factor that you are not charging for? So there's some equipment costs. Go ahead.
Overhead.
Yeah, so equipment costs and overhead, keep going.
Knowledge.
Bingo. Bingo. If everybody could do what you do, everybody would do what you do. If your doctor could make that crown cheaper, they would make the crown. I know what you're going to say. We've all seen that ugly pebble in somebody's mouth. That does not count. Come on. That's the thing. This whole reason for me standing here, the whole thing is because you are not charging for the most important thing that you are bringing to the equation. The entire flippin' industry changed, but you didn't. You are looking at this as a cost plus, and you had a massive shift in labor. Massive shift in labor. P.S. I have kids that are between 26 and 19, about to be 19 next week, and 26. Mechanical and aerospace engineering, biomedical engineering, the third one's in college, biomedical engineering. You think that they think because they work a computer, you're going to pay them less? Not my babies. They do not think that. Do you think because you can work a computer, you know what decades of dental technology has taught somebody? No, come on. I know that that's one of the problems. I know that one of the problems is you do hire somebody that's younger. They do have the computer skills, which is a gap right now, but they don't know anything about a tooth formation. And so you have to teach them that. You have a fixed overhead. That technology didn't come with no price tag. So if you were the person, and everybody was, if you were the person who borrowed your competitor's pricing, and your competitor is making, PFMs that they can churn out all day, and they're really good at it and they can do it cheaper, but you went and purchased, CAD/CAM equipment, and there's a fixed overhead cost to that. That is a differential, but the biggest differential is what? Is your knowledge. Is your knowledge, regardless of which one you make. Why would the one that you make via CAD be cheaper? You are allowing your customer's ignorance to drive your price down. True story. So when I got to Pankey, we had mostly older people who came, and I loved them to pieces, and I am an and person, not an or person. So I wanted to bring younger dentists to Pankey. I really felt that the gap in the industry was going to be younger dentists, meaning that they didn't have the same kind of education that the people who are in the older generation got. They didn't have the same kind of lab partnership that their predecessors had because they weren't introduced to laboratory technology like their predecessors had been. So we started to I did all kinds of scholarships, and I started doing classes for even D3 and D4 dental students to come in and just see the basics. Because what we realized is the programs that we ran there were called the Essentials, and Essentials 1, which is honestly, it's really diagnostic record taking. But what we realized is that when we were bringing them an E1, which had been forever at Pankey, C1 or E1, the very first thing, diagnostic record taking, not a big deal. We were just showing them a system, which the AACD system now is built off of what Pankey's system was for diagnostic record taking. Series of photos, how do you take an impression? We did digital and analog, retraction, prepping a crown, all of those like normal 101 things. We realized there was a gap between even what they were learning in dental school and that, and not a little gap. There was a bigger gap than we thought. So we started doing scholarships for the first year out. When they got out and they were out 1 year, we did a scholarship and we hosted a course because we were shocked to see how big a gap there was there. So I was like, oh, do we create, what's before E1? Do we create something before that? And we started to do that. So, every time I tell this story, someone thinks it was an older dentist, but it was not. So I tell you about that because a lot of the dental schools have digital technology. I think you guys know that. But not all of them really use it really effectively. So we have this class, this E1 class, 50% of the class is like young, recent graduates. The other 50% of the class is probably, we were usually like 40 and under for most of our E classes. People were out of dental school 5 years or less. So we have an iTero machine. So we go in and the way we would do E1 is we would do a physical impression and then we would do an intraoral scanned impression. And we would show them both ways. And then we'd create models and all that fun stuff that afternoon. So our chairside assistant, she's in there and she's demoing how to take the intraoral impression. And we have stadium seating like this. And there's only like 4 rows. And I'm sitting off to the side and I'm watching Sandra do the intraoral impression. And, we had the iTero machine with a cart. So it's kind of round and sleek looking. So there's a doctor sitting up like 3 rows and I see he keeps getting up and kind of looking and she finishes with it and she puts the wand down and she's kind of talking them through like, here's the imaging and here's how I double checked and blah, blah, blah. So next thing I know, now he's kind of standing up more and he's almost at a full stand. And so I kind of get her attention and I'm like pointing, he has a question. And she says, oh, sure, doctor, what, do you have a question? He's like, yeah. And she said, okay, what is it? And he said, where does the model come out? What's the answer? Costa Rica. So I was like, we did not have, we could never get iTero to actually give us the ability to actually fabricate the model, which was very frustrating to me, because then I could never show the doctor the efficacy of the scanned model versus the efficacy of the model that we poured. They're lost. So, but I was so shocked by that. We thought he was kidding. We really did. There was like dead silence in the room for a minute. And then we realized he wasn't. And I, by that point in time, had said Costa Rica. So I'm kind of going to beat this into you because I'm showing you that over decades, the industry has changed. And we just really haven't made that change. So technology comes with a bigger price tag, but it also comes with a new set of skills. So if you're discounting the skills that you have, just your knowledge base on how to create a crown or a prosthesis, you are very much in jeopardy of discounting the knowledge that it takes to take that in an analog form and take it to a digital form. We have now, and it's fine, and this is not about manufacturers, but so our manufacturers have come to us and said, there's an easier way to do this. And we're like, absolutely. They said, it takes less time, it'll save you money. And we're like, awesome, that's great. And you bought that, and it had a price tag that came with it, right? And it had a price tag for materials that were totally different. So now it's not like you reduce, does anybody doesn't use any porcelain anymore? I mean, now you've got 2 materials, right? You've got your zirconia pucks and your porcelain. So, but it came with knowledge, a new set of knowledge. You had to train a new group of people. You had to have new space in your lab. But we, in our minds, decided that because it was going to be less expensive for us, which is it? But it would be less expensive for us because we wouldn't have the man hours, it somehow is a cheaper product to produce. So in every place except for dentistry, When we can find a more efficient, cheaper way of doing something, but the market still finds it valuable, we call that margin. Don't laugh at me, Paul, because it's true. We call it margin, and we like it. If Hershey's found a way to create the same quality of chocolate, or even, I dare say, a better quality of chocolate, package that and distribute that cheaper because they had a new cocoa supplier, or FedEx, let's say, and Hershey's like, whoo, hold on. Before we used to have some guy stamp every bar of chocolate. Now we do it on a computer and it goes through a system like that. Does Hershey's charge less for the candy bar that you buy today in the grocery store than they did in 1970? No. 1980? No. Do they routinely go up on that price? Yes. Margin. So change does bring opportunity, but we have to get our heads around it, and we have to kind of develop a mindset. And it's not just about like me, I'm not here to make you feel bad about your business. I'm really here to show you that these changes happened, and then to kind of walk you through, so what can I do? So can you think of something that you're doing now that doesn't support where you want to be? Like, when's the last time you guys looked at and it's not just about pricing, it's really not. I'm making a big deal about pricing, but it's because that's what fuels the economic engine. I mean, before I adjusted pricing, I would go back and look. Do I have a fixed overhead sheet? I'm certain that if this isn't something you guys have, I'm certain this is something that Bennett could give you. I've worked with doctors on it. I mean, I've worked and trained doctors on how to set up their pricing. And we do that simple of thing, how to give an estimate. Because they will lose their fanny sometimes. You know, what does the doctor do? The doctor gives a treatment plan and forget, not veteran doctors, but younger doctors, and forget, they guess at the lab bill. Or they quote the patient the cheapest lab on the treatment plan because they're afraid that the patient's going to reject the treatment plan, so they lowered it by 1.5% for the lab bill. And then they did all this beautiful work, and then got this kind of ugly restorations. So if it's been a while since you visited how you come up with your pricing, I would encourage you to go back and do that. And at Pankey, we would teach a doctor a really simple thing. We would have this little simple worksheet that they would fill out. It is time, chair time, fixed overhead, material cost, those kinds of things, the lab bill, time for seating, all that kind of stuff. And then they would come up with an estimate for that. But then what we would have them do is track over a 3-month period when they actually billed, how close were they to their so then they would add margin, obviously, to it. How close were they? And then they would see if their fees were higher or lower than they wanted them to be. Higher or lower. There's a piece in there that's about confidence of a doctor presenting the treatment plan as well. So sometimes it takes more than 3 months for them to be able to get enough treatment plans where somebody really accepts the treatment plan. Okay, so we're going to talk about mindset. Does this sound like a hippie word, mindset? So I had a traditional parent and a hippie parent. I had both of those. So I'm forever confused. Like, I had this very traditional, my dad was a police chief, you get up at 6 o'clock every morning, you're not late for anything, if you say you're going to do something, you do it. Very traditional, very regimented person. My mom owned a hair salon. Does anybody see Crazy Hot Matrix, the hairstylist one? Anyway, so my mom owned a hair salon. My parents could have not been more dissimilar. My mom was like, it'll be there when I get there. It's okay not to feel good, but you shouldn't burden other people with not looking good. I'm not kidding. She told me that. That is a direct quote. When I had strep throat and my parents were hosting a party, I was like, Mommy, I feel so sick. Honey, it's fine to not feel good, but you cannot burden other people with not looking good. Come on. What in the hell? So mindset is like, for me, both my parents have passed away, so now I can talk about them freely. But for me, mindset sounded like this hippie kind of thing until I was working, frankly, when I was working at Pinky, and I realized that that there was a lot of things that held people back, and it was how we think about things. So, well, I'm going to go back to this. Here's one quick mindset thing. We're never going to live like beyond COVID. Now we live with COVID. Like, this is one of those things that happens in a lifetime that impacts the way you think forever. It's like, so you talk about grandparents, people who went through the Depression, or who, the post 9/11, pre 9/11. There are things that happen in life that change the way you think. Kids who were born, people who were born before 9/11, and then like my children who were children when we experienced 9/11. My children all went to school where they with active shooter training, where they have taught my children how to get out of a classroom. That was the saddest thing for me. When my daughter was 9 years old and came home, and I asked her how her day was and what happened with her day, and she told me that today they learned how their teacher has a false closet in her room that has a door that leads to outside for active shooter training. That will change how she thinks forever. It just will. COVID has that kind of impact. It will change how we think. Does anybody find themselves watching TV and like something happens or a movie and there's like a bunch of people and they're close together and you're like, oh my gosh, they have no masks on? Or they do things like, does that just happen to me? I see that now and I'm like, oh, that is a germ fest. Like, what in the world? How does that even happen? True thing happened. I was here in October, and I shared that the man that I spend my life with, he has cancer, and he was diagnosed last summer, and it was just a gut punch to us. We were not expecting it. He wasn't symptomatic. He just started having some back pain. He rides his bike 14 miles a day and was having back pain. So at the time, we had 2 kids in college. My daughter, who was a senior in high school, getting ready to go to college, my youngest son, who was in college, and then the 2 older boys who were both graduated 26, 27. So we have to have this really serious conversation with our family. We have to have another conversation about COVID. Like, hey, everybody's got to be super careful because when you're in chemo, you cannot get COVID. So with 2 college kids, this is the conversation we're having. Like, hey, I want you to have a really good time at college, but you can't bring home COVID. So everybody's super careful. The son that lives in South Florida is getting tested before he comes to visit. I mean, all of this stuff. He actually ends up getting it like last summer, all this stuff. So we're being really careful. I go to the grocery store, Michael doesn't, all of that kind of stuff. So everybody's home for Christmas. Everybody gets tested before they're home for Christmas. We're all fine. We go through Christmas, and on New Year's Eve, Michael starts to not feel good, and he starts to run a really high fever, 103.7, can't break the fever. Christmas or New Year's Day, I take him to the ER. They're worried he has pneumonia, pump him through with a bunch of stuff and send him home. And then we get the call that evening. You've tested positive for COVID. I'm like, no, no. He had just had cancer treatment, like a chemo treatment, like 5 days before. I'm like, no way, no. So I call all of our kids. I'm like, hey, everybody needs to get tested because one of you must have COVID because Michael has COVID. So all the kids get tested. I mean, we had girlfriends, everybody was in our friggin' house. Nobody, not a girlfriend, not a son, not a kid, even our college kids, nobody tests positive for COVID. The next day, Michael calls the cancer center because he says, hey, I'm supposed to come back in 2 weeks, but they told me to tell you that I tested positive for COVID. So she's like, oh, we are beside ourselves. 15 of our nurses have COVID. Guess where he got COVID? So, no matter what the preparation was, no matter how careful we were, he got COVID from the freaking cancer treatment center, which is not funny, but it's only funny now because he did really well with it and he's fine. So, and now he's been immunized. but it changes the way we think forever. That's my point about it. We will never think the same. So let's talk about mindset. How many people think you can change your own mind? I just changed my mind today. I made a decision, I changed my mind, I'm going to a different decision. Yeah? Yeah. We change our mind. How many people do it all the time, all day long, right? Yeah, sure. Thought I wanted a banana, got in the kitchen, saw an Oreo, much better choice. I mean, so we change our mind all day long. So when we're thinking about how we approach our life and our work and how much of this is about mindset, and what I'm wondering is, are you applying an old way of thinking to a new way of doing business? So that's the whole point, is we have an old way of thinking, which was, I'm just going to use a PFM way, and I have nothing against a PFM, I've got one. So, but it's just an old way of thinking, not of manufacturing, of thinking. The old way of thinking did not account for your knowledge. And that's been probably my frustration for 20 years in this business, is the old way of thinking did not account for your knowledge. And I'm going to say, when there were 14,000 certified dental technicians and 20-something thousand labs, and this industry was full of people who went to dental laboratory technology school and partnered with dentists, and dentists had bigger knowledge of dental laboratory technology, you could see some allowances for that. I was begrudging about that, but you could see some allowances. When you are in the environment we are in today, where we have a tremendous amount of dentists that are 55 and younger, did not have dental laboratory technology in school, especially those who are 45 and younger, were not exposed to that, don't know anything. You are the repository for knowledge for the materials. You absolutely are. You know more about materials than 10 of your clients combined. You just do. So I'm concerned that we're applying an old way of thinking to a new environment. So this is the definition of mindset: a fixed mental attitude or disposition that predetermines a person's response. It's a fixed mental mindset. This is the second part of the definition: an inclination, tendency, or habit, a person's usual attitude, mental state, and way of thinking. So I think mindset is a habit. I do. I think we get into a habit of a way of thinking. And I know this because 10 years I worked on the laboratory side, could not have loved laboratories more, could not have had more respect for dental technicians. And my mindset was, dentists do not care about quality. That was absolutely my mindset. Absolutely. I was going to go to Pankey and make them care. So I get to Pankey and my mindset is they don't care. And what I find is they just don't know. Don't care and don't know are very different things, and they require a very different mindset approach. Don't care, you are going to find a difficult time making somebody who doesn't care. Don't know, ooh, that's a fun platform because I can educate with don't know. So I looked at habit. So could I get myself into a habit of a different mindset? Does anybody know who this guy is? I know, she keeps pulling these old pictures from the internets. I'll give you a hint. Ooh. Yes, Charles Darwin. Very good. Can anybody tell me what he's most famous for? It's a theory of evolution. He wrote a book called The Origin of Species. What is the theory of evolution? What is and this is not political and this is not religious. This is just scientific. Survival of the fittest. Does everybody agree with that? Survival of the fittest, right? That is what he is most quoted for. Thank you very much for saying that. Okay. I was in 3rd grade and I did a science project. And it was about this. It was like where you had to take well, it's not what you had to, but so I got this tadpole from this local pond and photographed this tadpole back with 35 millimeter and watched this tadpole become a frog and started to read about Darwinism. P.S. I went to Catholic school, not popular. I'm a rebel. I really was not popular. They really did invite me to not do that, but I did it anyway. So I was very fascinated by this concept because I grew up Catholic and I thought, I knew the concept of creationism, and I thought the concept of evolution was interesting. So I read a whole bunch of stuff, and in 3rd grade, something got under my skin, and it was that Darwin is probably the most misquoted theory ever. Darwin's theory is actually not survival of the fittest. I don't know where that came from. This is what Darwin's theory says. He says organisms change over time, and their changes come from external factors and their own behaviors and reactions to those factors. What Darwin's theory was most revolutionary about it is Darwin says when they make those changes become hereditary. That was what was cool about it, is the changes become hereditary. So you understand what that means? It means we can pass it on to our offspring. So from both external factors and behaviors, the organism made a change, and then the change could become hereditary. So changes that allow an organism to better adapt to its environment will help it survive and have more offspring. Darwin's theory, not saying to you because everybody thinks this, we all think this, everybody says this, Darwin's theory is not about survival of the fittest, or else these dudes would still be here and we would not. They were the fittest. They were the least adaptable. So Darwin's theory is about adaptation to your environment and adaptation in your behavior. So if you take nothing away, know that that guy has been misquoted. He wrote that in 1859. What the heck? That's a long time for us to all, what is going on in public school here? I was in private school, it still sucked. So I'm going to walk you through some steps to adjust your thinking. And these are going to be super simple, but I can't stand letting you walk away with just stories about my life and watching me almost ruin a computer. So old way of thinking, new way. So here's the first step. This is the easiest step and the hardest step. The first word here is challenge your thinking. I'm not saying change your thinking, I'm saying challenge your own way of thinking. And so what I mean by that is most of the time if things don't go our way, if we had a hope, if we had a goal for sales or we had a goal for production and it doesn't go the way we think it should go, the first thing we do is what? We look at external factors, right? What's happening out there to make this not work? That's just human nature. We always look externally. I'm going to say challenge your own thinking. How did I come up with that goal? Challenge the way you got there. Not who did it, not the task, the thought process. So very first thing, challenge your thinking. I love this because I've had to go into organizations as the executive and create change. And the one thing about organizations is that they, even when they know that they're going to go out of business or they know that they need change, they will fight. I love boards of directors, but they will fight so hard. Even when the way that we've been doing things is about to drive us into bankruptcy, they will fight to keep it. They'll say, oh, no. Nope. Historically, we've done it this way, and our members like it. I'm like, well, you're about to go out of business, so we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking that helped create the problem. Albert Einstein. So challenge your thinking. Second step, explore your biases. So we all have bias. And I think this is kind of big. So for example, my bias was that dentists don't care. So I had to explore that bias and say, well, wait a minute, I'm seeing something that counters that. So where did that come from? Well, that came from, honestly, environments like this, where people who were above the average got together to learn, which is above the average, and to share, which is above the average. But the two biggest questions that I overheard when I started the lab industry, The first one, and I don't understand this one, but every time I would meet new people, like 2 new lab owners would meet each other, they would always ask the same question. How big's your lab? How big's your lab? I'm like, who cares? I never understood that question. Someone will explain it to me, but I always would hear that. I would go to like a big national meeting, and that's what I would hear people say, how big's your lab? How big's your lab? So we ended up doing a whole JDT cover on it. I'm like, I don't get it. My thing would be, how much money you make last year? How profitable are you? That's what I want to know. I mean, I don't think you're allowed to ask that in polite company, but that's what I would want to know. What's your margin? I don't care how big your lab is. Because if you have 2 people in your lab and you are making 25%, 30% margin, and you're able to, you know, I'd rather have 2 people and make $1 million than have 20 people and make $1 million, right? First of all, there's just some inherent things that say that margin will be bigger if I have 2 people make $1 million. I understand that that's a difficult stretch, but that's what I would rather have. So explore your biases. What kind of thinking has gotten you here? What's the bias that you have? Is the bias that do you have bias around only a certain size lab can do certain things? Do you have a bias around what you think your doctors need to know, or what you think your doctors feel? Are you thinking that your doctors don't care? Fundamentally, you can't be in a relationship with people who don't care. So explore your bias.
There's a phrase I love, stinking thinking.
And so what does that mean to you?
Well, it's just, you know, ask yourself all the time, you know, what are you, you know, what are you doing? What's holding you back?
Yeah.
Or, you know, if something's not right in your life, you know, what are you thinking? And so always review that. And if it's, you know, if it's way too negative, you know, there's probably a good reason to take pause.
Mm-hmm. That question, what's holding you back, I have that question, that's a question I ask myself all the time. If I ever get stuck or there's something I really don't like, I ask myself that question all the time, like what's really holding me back? What's really the root of this? And this is a whole other presentation, but there's a lot of fear kind of things. So inherently as human beings, we have a fear of rejection. So a lot of times this is what holds you back from having a real conversation with a doctor, is you're afraid if you tell the doctor, like if you just made this one tiny change, doctor, like capture the margin, then we could create so much of a better restoration for you. But your fear is that the doctor will say, you know what, Alan, I don't think you're that smart and I'm gonna go work for another lab. I'd be like, peace be with you. So I like this quote, John Lubbock, who doesn't like, but what we see depends mainly on what we look for. So it's kind of the same thing. If you're looking for the thing to affirm your current way of thinking, then that's what we're going to see. But if you're looking for something to test your current way of thinking, then that's what you will see. So can anybody think of any bias that you currently have? Are there bias around you have to be a certain size lab to do this? You have to, there was absolutely a bias in the room about the PFM versus the all ceramic. Right? The bias is the PFM you should charge more for it because it had more labor hours. How many remakes did you have with doing that's a lot of labor hours, but what happens? What's our other bias? If nobody sees it, it is not a remake. These are not the droids you're looking for. It never happened. Meanwhile, how many pucks are on the floor? How much time, how many 4-letter words have come out? Like, those are all, I feel like the more I'm frustrated, the more I cuss, the higher my price is gonna go. So true. So I used to be married to a custom home builder, and he had this thing, they had this thing on there when they were putting together a quote for a home, and it was like, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, but it was called PIA, it was like PIA fee. And one day I saw it because I was reconciling something for his books, and I was like, what's this? And he's like, oh, that's our PIA fee. And it was like 2%. It wasn't like, it was some money. I said, I don't remember that. Where do you want me to put that fee? He's like, right there at the bottom line. I said, what's a PIA fee? He said, these are a big, and so I'm getting paid for that. I was like, oh, he seemed so smart then. We're not married anymore. Step 3. Probably I paid that fee, actually. So here's the third one, create new habits. This is going to seem so fundamental, but the reality is how do you get out of old habits? So if you need to get more exercise, and you love to spend your first morning sitting on the couch drinking coffee, but you want to be healthier, what do? You create a new habit, right? You replace your old habit with a new habit. This is probably the most difficult part of it. So if you challenge the way you think and you explore your bias, and then you create a new habit. And that habit actually replaces the old one. So Aristotle, excellence is a form of a habit. It's a form of doing something the same way over and over again, something really well. It's not an act. It is a repetitive motion. And you know this because that's how you create good restorations. You have built habits in how you create your restorations, which have resulted in a great restoration. Or if you're a lab owner, how many of you have hired a technician and they're a good technician and you see that they make the same mistake over and over again, and you know it's just that they are in the habit of doing something in a certain way, which is either inefficient or leads to a margin of error. I know that you guys know this. You've had to retrain that, and God, it's so hard, isn't it? And won't that person really fight to say, no, this is the way I've always done it? So you have to help that person create a new habit. So that's what this is. Much of our mindset is built from our experiences and our habits. So simple things, right? There's more to this, but today I just wanted to leave you with something that was not overwhelming. The other things are about, how do you hold yourself accountable? How do you make adjustments? Meaning how do you review when you do something and go back to the first thing, challenge your thinking, and make adjustments in that? But these are 3 things that I would just ask you to consider based on all of that information that I gave you about what's going on with dental practices, the history lesson that I gave you, 50 years of CAD CAM and 50 years of globalization, which is the nice way of FedEx. You have the opportunity to make the change. But just go back and start with changing your mindset. I always want to end with something that is a little bit inspirational too. I was really fortunate that even though my parents were very different from one another, they were both really bold people. And they raised a house full of daughters, which was a bane of both of their existences, but in different ways. And the 2 things that they instilled, besides hard work, was just the willingness to be daring. And I think that this is such a nice poem. You have so many opportunities. You just have to step into them. Dare to be that person today that helps somebody else. Talk to somebody that you've never spoken to before. Listen to somebody that you have not listened to before. Consider putting "and" in your thought process instead of "or." So what I mean by that is we have been trained to think it's either this way or this way. It's either Ricky's opinion or it's Paul's opinion. And and I would say this, as a nation, we've become very polarized. It's either what I think or what you think. I'm either right, and if I'm right, then you must be wrong. I think it's an "and." It can be my opinion and Paul's opinion. And there can be something really great in the middle of that. So challenge yourself to have a conversation with somebody today and learn something new from that. Think in the terms of the and instead of the or. That could be your very first mindset change. So I would love to stay connected with you. I have this fun little every 2-week blog that I send out. It's called Beyond a Pep Talk, because as much as I was a cheerleader and I like to do that, I also like to give some very tactical advice on how to be a better leader, on how to run your business better. And so my website is at the bottom. And I can also, I think that Kate will probably share some stuff with me, and I can send you a little email as a follow-up, because I want to, if you want the handouts for this or part of the handouts for this, you can get them for sure. If you're curious about success coaching or changing your mindset or improving your business, today I talked about mindset, but honestly a lot of what I do is much more practical. It's helping a leader create a plan that has some tactics that they take back into your workplace and can actually grow your business for them. So I have something called a virtual coffee. You're welcome to schedule a virtual coffee. It is free because you are at your place and I am at my place, and we both bring our own coffee. So you're more than welcome to do that. And I guess I will ask if you have any questions. I didn't give you a lot to have a lot of questions about, did I? Any questions? Awesome. Thank you very much for having me back, for ignoring the fact that I created a small flood over here. I'm going to hope that this dries up over here. But thank you so much for allowing me to be here today. And actually, I'm going to take your picture. Why? Because I can. Look how cute you guys are. Yay. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.